Welcome to Be Well. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Jonathan from Your Why. I'm honored to have the opportunity to bring you these conversations with leaders in their field related to living mindfully. As your moderator, I come to you with 30 plus years experience in mindfulness, wellness, and mental health. I love a quote by Thich Nhat Hanh that says, "To be mindful is to be truly alive, present, and at one with those around you and with what you are doing." And I believe this is relevant to our conversation today related to racism, because it's how we choose to act, think, and feel. Our topic today is overcoming anti-Asian racism. Our guest is Dr. Nellie Tran. Dr. Tran is an associate professor at the community-based block at San Diego State University, the Department of Counseling and Psychology, School Psychology Program. She's also the vice president of the Asian American Psychological Association. And recently I connected with Dr. Tran. She was cited in an article, an op-ed piece that she put together with a couple of colleagues related to this issue of anti-Asian racism. The topic or the title of that op-ed piece, "Don't Feel Sorry for Us, Act Against Hate." And so all of this is coming to a greater focus because there really is a chorus of voices at this point that are rising in the condemnation of the hatred that is directed at Asian American Pacific Islanders and their community. And this has grown since 6 Asian American women were among 8 people killed in Atlanta. And so this is the backdrop to our conversation today. So Dr. Tran, thank you for being with us today. I know you have a great deal of expertise in these conversations and in dealing with racism. So first off, our hope is to have a greater understanding today of how anti-Asian racism has come about. So first off, what is anti-Asian racism?
Well, anti-Asian racism has a long history here in the US. And really, we're talking about racism that has been aimed towards Asian and Asian Americans. And we have legal policies and federal policies that have kind of gone back as early as the 1800s and have kind of existed throughout history. And currently today, what we're seeing is this not just a resurgence. I think it's an escalation and an amplification of what has happened. And so right now there's a larger dialogue around anti-Asian racism, but really the conversation I think is that Asians have not typically been at the center of conversations around racism. And so at this moment, there is an attention, a focal point on how have Asians been impacted by racism here in the US.
I actually was reading an article recently by Representative Ted Lieu here in California, and he was speaking to what he calls is a political awakening of Asian Americans, where there was a greater voice and opportunity to be heard at this point in time to really speak to the oppression, the victimization, the trauma that has occurred for some time, as you said, historically, but is being propagated now. So where do we go from here? It's coming to a greater focus and attention. It's in conversations. So first, before we go there, how has our Asian community been impacted by this escalation that we're seeing?
I think, here, especially in Southern California, we see this escalation because we have a larger concentration of Asian Americans here in Southern California and lots of larger metropolitan areas across the country. And I think we saw a larger rise in anti-Asian, not just racism, but also in discrimination and exclusion in the early days when COVID and shelter in place happened, with the rhetoric that was happening at our highest levels of leadership with Donald Trump at the time, talking about the China virus and using other derogatory terms to talk about the coronavirus. businesses were the first to kind of see a drop in business and to be personally hurt by the rhetoric and the misinformation about, the virus coming from those of Asian descent. And from there, I think we've seen more kind of mainstream media representations of the violence, but it's interesting because, some of my earliest writings about this were back in my early career, my graduate school days in 2010. And this isn't new. People are pulling up articles that I've written over a decade ago, talking about racisms that happened then. I think the advent of cameras and 24-hour news cycles have really kind of amplified what's going on, and security cameras and such. And I think in this very moment, we owe a great deal of our ability to talk about anti-Asian racism to our African American and Black siblings, who I think really created the start of the racial awakening. And I think last summer being one of the big moments, but certainly for years before that. So I feel like what we can do now is for the racial awakening is also happening within the Asian and Asian American community. There has been a great divide among our community. The pan-ethnic term of Asian American was created as a political movement to bring solidarity among Asian ethnic groups that haven't always been friendly to one another on the Asian continent, right? The same kind of imperialism, colonization, and kind of interethnic troubles happened back in Asia as well. Each country kind of has rivalries and warfare with other countries. But here in the US, those of us who were born here kind of have been raised kind of to be politically aligned with one another as Asian Americans. And perhaps that has a lot to do with the fact that there aren't many areas where Asian Americans live. There are so few Asians that to have kind of critical mass, you have to come together with others who look a little bit closer, who are a little bit more culturally aligned. And I think now with the anti-Asian racism, we're starting to see how racism has impacted Asian Americans over our lifetime. I think there's a great miseducation of Asians and about Asian Americans, and that it feels like an intentional miseducation of our people that has excluded us from American history, has prevented Asians from seeing ourselves as part of the community of people of color. And so now I think it's been a ripe time to bring solidarity among our communities of color and other allies who would like to fight against white supremacy and against systems of oppression. And so I think that really is the calling of this time, and that the Stop Asian Hate is really a calling to stop all hate, right? All racial hate. And that I would like to see us as a community work on this broader goal, because we can't be moving. I don't see great product in moving from movement to movement without coming together. In some ways, that reinforces the idea that we each only get a month of the year to celebrate, right? Like we're doing Heritage Months, and it seems that way with this movement as well. We can't just capitalize on a moment for each group, but rather allow each moment to build on prior movements so that we can continue to grow the movement to get greater justice in this country.
So Dr. Tran, I know you shared that you've been writing about this racism for quite some time. Are you hopeful at this moment in time, in this moment in history, so to speak, that we can actually make significant inroads? Or do you see this as another time that will pass? I'm just trying to see how you see it, but I'm wanting to know from your perspective, especially in education, because you have the opportunity to write some of the misrepresentation, to write how things are characterized. So I wonder what your outlook is currently.
Oh gosh, that's it feels sometimes like a loaded question. I think we have to, in this business, you have to be hopeful. There's if I weren't hopeful about our future generations, I wouldn't work so hard to make sure that they got critical education and that they saw themselves in the history, and that I had an opportunity to correct the miseducation that they might have had in their earlier K through 12 education. But I feel like I have also, my history reminds me to carry with me a healthy dose of skepticism.
Mm.
So I think I have a lot of hope, and it would be unusual, I think, of me to be completely optimistic. I think I am not surprised by what is going on. I think the saying goes, I'm never surprised, but I'm always shocked. That it's, I expect this to happen. I think I've been saying for years, when in our participation in the Black Lives Matter movement with the Asian American community, if Black lives don't matter, then neither do Asian lives. It is just a matter of time. And in fact, many ethnic groups in the Asian American diaspora have been targets of racism over the last last many decades, and throughout history. So it's helping those who may be newer to the conversation to see that there's an illusion that if we get closer to whiteness, that we will be allowed into this, sacred American dream where racism doesn't exist, and where truly, meritocracy exists, where if you only work hard, then that's all that matters. And I think folks are realizing their reality is being shaken up a little bit, and they're entering their racial identity development stages where they now realize that perhaps that reality was not always true. And that's where I feel hope, right? That if people can move in their racial identity development, and I can be there, folks like myself and other folks can be there to support our community as they move through racial identity development stages, that we can help them safely move from a place that lacks awareness to one of critical awareness.
Dr. Chan, if I could ask you to give me a broader description of how you're using that term, racial identity movement, because I want to make sure we have a common understanding, because I think if we're looking for development in that area, I think we all want to understand what that actually means.
Yeah, so in psychology, we talk a lot about development of all sorts of different identities, and one of which is racial identity. And race being something that you learn about, right? You're not born with it; you learn about it over time. Often happens with a critical moment of encounter, where you learn that you are not that you are different from other people. For people of color, that's typically what it is. White folks also have racial identity development, white identity development, where they first encounter a moment of learning about their whiteness, and that kind of starts a process where you start to realize, okay, so if I am other, then what has this always meant? What does it mean to be different from other people? What does it mean to be, if for me, it would be learning that I'm Asian, and the Asian is not white, is not Black, is not Hispanic. Like, what does that mean? And how do I feel about that? And oftentimes people feel as though they have been miseducated, that they have been withheld information. And so perhaps then they want to surround themselves with other people who identify in similar ways, so they can learn more about what it means to be Asian American, or whatever racial identity you identify with. And so you kind of immerse yourself within that culture, so you can learn more about that identity. Slowly, in that phase, oftentimes people will also reject other groups, especially as people of color. We tend to reject white peers and white others as we learn about ourselves. There's a differentiation and a separation that happens over time as we come to reconcile those differences. We begin to re-engage in and put everything back together, right? So then we develop out of those stages, and we begin to integrate all of the different groups and begin to work towards a common kind of humanity, where all racial groups can live together and can build. But it's not so linear, right? So people can jump around from different stages, and you can go back to a place where you don't think about race at all, have another encounter, and then go through the stages in different ways as well.
Dr. Chan, that was excellent. And
Mhm.
you just took me through a multicultural psychological course right there in the past. I really appreciate you providing that primer. I
Mhm.
really enjoyed the title of the op-ed piece that you put together with your colleagues. Don't feel sorry for us, instead act against hate. And so you
Mhm.
speak to having us first off understand how we participate in
Yeah.
this racial discrimination, and then in being accountable to that to take some action, be responsible. So if you could walk me through some of that.
Yeah. It's nice to be thought of. It's nice to be remembered. It's nice to have folks praying for us. Um, it- but it's not enough, right? I think I think folks feel powerless. And one of the things my colleagues and I wanted to remind folks is that you're not powerless, right? That these are things that exist and that are being perpetuated because we have allowed it to. Now, a lot of us are certainly not out on the streets perpetuating racism intentionally, but I think this is the part where we have to recognize that it is happening in our society, a society that we have some control over. And so we want people to feel a sense of agency and power over the situation at hand, and to be able to begin the work somewhere. And I think this has also, where we kind of begin the work is related to where people might be in their own racial identity development. I truly believe in meeting people where they're at. Right? Not everyone has gone the journey, and some people may be just starting out, and none of that is shameful. We've all been through different parts of the stages, and it's okay to just start the journey, but you have to start. And in each, depending on where you are, there are actions that we can take. And we really advocate for starting at home, starting with yourself, right? That it's great. We need policy. We want, hate crime policies to change and be inclusive. We want there to be more resources for education and for mental health services. And we want to protect our elders. We want all of that, yes. And that will come with time. But what will last longer is if people work from within and start with themselves. In what ways have we allowed anti-Asian racism to exist in our world? And we think simply about, how many jokes have you allowed to exist in our world, right? How many movies have you watched that have perpetuated stereotypes? How many times have you talked about Asian women as exotic beings rather than as whole human beings? And in what ways have you used derogatory terms without even realizing it? Can you educate yourself? Can you learn about all the different stereotypes that might exist about, with our community? And even more simply, there's a general image that Asian Americans are model minorities, meaning that we are high achieving, successful people. We've worked hard to get where we are, and we've done that despite discrimination and racism, and that those things don't impact us in the same way. And it's just simply not true, right? So to be able to break those images, I think starting at home would ripple across the system.
I appreciate that, because I think about the things that'll come in terms of making change in society and government and policy. That will be a natural evolution when we've done the business ourselves, but then we will advocate to make sure those things happen, or else there's still a detachment from it. And it kind of goes back to
Yeah.
the whole idea of feeling sorry for somebody. I think it keeps the issue at a distance versus really looking at our relationship to it.
Yes.
So if you will, Dr. Tron, where is there support for the Asian community and what they're doing? And what about allies, and how do allies participate in that process as well?
A lot of what I've been offering folks for this work is related to how we would act as allies for any movement, right? To amplify the voices and the stories of those who are being targeted, to truly listen to what it is they're asking for rather than to make assumptions. One of the big assumptions right now is that communities want more more safety in their communities through policing. And what we know is that local communities do not want more policing. They want to feel safe, and to really listen to that, right? Like that, because a community is asking for safety, do not make the assumption of what that means and how safety can be garnered. And I think a lot about the Atlanta shootings and the murders that happened there. Would those women have called the police? You know, especially, I don't like the language around calling them sex workers, because that comes with it another set of assumptions, and also demeans the work that they were doing. But would the police have even been a safe place for them, right? So there's this assumption that Asians would benefit from over policing, which is not true. For many of the communities here, especially here in Southern California, the police are not welcome. They have not treated Asian Americans, especially Southeast Asians, Filipinos, and other folks in low-income communities particularly well. And so I think we need to start, with listening to those stories, amplifying those voices, and working on bringing more communities together to think about, what would be helpful, and to support one another. I also think some of the bystander trainings and thinking about how we can be prepared when things happen would be especially helpful for all of our relational building, especially in these times with COVID. I think there's a lot of fears that come to mind right away when we're thinking about intervening or interacting. I know also for my fellow Asian Americans, we often beat ourselves up because something might happen, a microaggression, something subtle, and we freeze. And I want folks to know that how you react in moments of trauma is survival. It's not, we often can't control that. And the fact that we are ruminating about it or continually thinking about it, it tells us that something traumatic happened. And so in those moments, I hope that we can find gentleness and compassion for ourselves, that we experience something traumatic, and that, a lot of times we don't get help from those around us. And I think that ends up feeling more traumatizing than even the event itself. Oftentimes, if something racist happens to me, I can say that person was being racist. It's clear to me. But what I can't understand is why no one else helped me. I'm recalling memories of being on the subway in Chicago on many occasions and having derogatory things yelled at me, and the entire train is quiet. So everyone is hearing it. And I'm stuck in a corner, and no one stands up for me. No one intervenes. And I am a leader in racism work and yet I could not react or respond. And I think a lot about, well, I feared for my safety in that moment. And clearly I should, because no one stood up for me. No one was going to protect me. But I wondered, what would it have been like had someone just came over to me and stood with me? That's it, right? I think we have to remember that we don't have to intervene in a way that puts ourselves in harm's way. So we don't have to think about just the perpetrators, but really, how do we be with and stand with people who are being targeted?
That's a powerful example that you provided, Dr. Chan, and I appreciate you sharing that, because in some ways there's a complicitness of those that observe and don't engage, don't say something or intervene in some way. And so the example you get, and for the one that's experiencing the trauma, there is that compounding effect. And so I appreciate the whole idea of there's always something we can do as a bystander. There's something you can do, even if you're in fear. And so the whole idea of bystander training, are there resources out there that you can recommend where we can become more educated and literate in terms of how to engage as a bystander?
Yeah, there's a great training that's being offered for free by the Asian American Advancing Justice group. And they offer a training called Holler Back, HOLLA back. And I've heard great things about it. It's short, it's simple, but really amplifying that, really building confidence in all the things that you can do and say. I think there, we're talking about racism, but it's still the case that microaggressions and kind of more subtle things happen on a regular basis, and we need help in those moments too. And I think it's important for those who are targets of racism to know that it makes a world of difference to know that how to be able to stand up for yourself in those moments. And I often will say that if you can muster the courage to just say ouch, that or I also have a very expressive face, and so when something happens, I often I just kind of what and that reaction helps me to stand up for myself. It helps me to tell the person I'm talking with, like, that something there did not feel right, and I may not even know how to speak on it, but it takes the onus of responsibility off of me, right? I don't have to live in that moment by myself. And if there are bystanders, what is really helpful is to signal that, right? To be the one that takes the risk to be like, ooh, that's not right, or just to be like, I think you should stop there, or to legitimately say, hey, Nellie, let's go, let's walk out of the room together, right? Like, it signals to me that you're with me and that you witnessed something unsavory happen.
Yes. I know we're almost out of time for today. I just wonder, what is our next step as an ally in terms of, I hear you saying to offer solidarity, to join the movement, to participate. There might be those that are farther back and kind of observing. And so what would you offer to them in terms of a next step to further their support in this way?
I would highly recommend doing some work on yourself, learning the history that you might not have been privileged to receive. Reading books about the Japanese American internment and learning about how that happened and how we continue to allow that type of abuse to happen in our country. To learn about stereotypes and I think the interpersonal, stopping of the small and minor is really important. I also think it's really important to really think about and advocate for where we are missing representation of Asian Americans, and especially to be thinking about not just dominant East Asian groups, but also to be thinking about the diversity within Asian America, Southeast Asians, South Asians, Pacific Islanders, and to think about how those communities may have been impacted differently by war, by colonization. And I think, there's been a big call to check on your Asian friends and colleagues, which I actually find a little bit difficult, because not everyone is having the same kind of outreach happen for them. And also, it sometimes signals to me how far out you had to go to reach an Asian person in your network. And so to really think about, how can you build the diversity within your own networks, right? Asian people, especially here in San Diego, exist all around us. You don't have to look far, right? But to really think about where we exist within your world. My mom was a manicurist for years and interacted with lots of different people, but those people never considered her someone that they could have in their circle, because they found her, she was invisible, she was of service to them. And so I often tell people, yes, maybe we're not in your neighborhood, but we exist in your community. And will you allow us into your circle? Will you learn our names? Will you learn our stories? And to start at home, bring us into the communities. We exist. And when we say we're hurting, listen to us and amplify that.
Wow, Dr. Shen, you've given me a lot to think about and provided some wonderful education. I appreciate the expertise that you've offered and what you've brought through in the conversation. There's a lot of resources that are available through the work that you're doing at San Diego State, the articles that you've written, and also in the chat. I greatly appreciate our time together and look forward to truly having some change come about in our community, where, as you said, we stop hate, all hate. And I appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for this opportunity and for spotlighting what's going on in our communities.
Most definitely. My pleasure. Thank you. And to all those that joined us, be well until we get together again next time. So thank you very much.